So I'll start again with the caveat that this is specifically around Tom's story and how we work. It's not an instruction manual, but one of the things that's been a real point of pride for us is this graph. And I think the planning of training or periodisation, or it's bigger than periodisation, has been a real part of this and one of our strengths. And we pride ourselves on our ability to be in good shape when it counts. And I think Tom's record probably speaks for itself over the last maybe 5-6 years about his ability to contend at major championships. And it's something that is maybe by a little bit of luck, a little bit of chance, but there's quite a bit of thought and design that goes into it. So hopefully I can shine a bit of a light on that and how we think about it to keep that graph going up. Moving puzzle. Tom's a different person every day, as we all are. But there's some really significant stuff I wanted to point out. So a little side-by-side comparison across 4 years, 2015 to this year, 2019. 5 years. I don't know why his age is 5 years different, but he is 4 years different. Well picked up. I'm a maths teacher too. Wilco talked about David being having a 5-week reserve response time, and it's good that they know this information. It's worth gathering some data on for you and your athletes if you're not already, because when you can figure out the amplitude of that adaptation cycle, that really has formed the basis of everything we do, and we work back from that now. So as a 22-year-old, we pretty much knew Tom has a 12 to 15 day overshoot lag being the time between stimulus and maximum adaptation. Right? So you can see some nodding heads, kind of understand the theory behind that. Yep. And so we would backtrack, so 2 weeks out from World Championships, would be putting the last real stimulus in and then hit the handbrake and trust that the effects are going to kick in.
Wow.
Not the case anymore. As Tom's strength reserves have gone up, and these are different physical characteristics, those reserves last longer. Therefore, we pull the handbrake further in, and I think we stopped any really heavy training this year pretty much a month out from World Champs, so the start of September, and then back next year it's going to be even more. So there's a real imperfect science here to this, but it gets a little scary because we're talking 6 to 8 weeks out from the Olympics, pretty much shutting everything down and doing bare minimum training. When I say bare minimum training, it's still high quality, but relative to some of the other phases that I'll get to later. And there's a big trust component that goes with that too, because everything in your being is saying, here comes a major championship, here comes the pinnacle event, I want to get ready for this, let's do more. And there's this tug of war between what we know and what we feel. And that's where the sort of emotional management side of things comes in, and it certainly helps. It's much easier to deal with this now because we've done it for a number of years. We can kind of see it coming and be prepared, but there's some real angst in the early phases of when we bring in this overshoot period. So again, why the 12 to 15 days as a 22-year-old? Moderate strength reserves, now very high strength reserves. Doesn't lose much over time. Young Tom needed a lot of proof to throw fast. Training needed to be good. Body needed to be good. Confidence needed to be high. Conditions sometimes needed to be good. Now moderately patient. Questions about that?
Yeah, it's just to don't make the mistakes. What do you mean exactly by overshoot? Like, I don't understand. If we take the example with the strength, what do you mean by the overshoot?
I'm going to borrow this whiteboard again. It's my school teacher coming out.
overcompensation?
Yeah, super compensation.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, it's okay? Yeah. Overshoot. Yeah. It's okay. Any other questions on that one before we move? It's kind of an important concept because it forms the, like, anyone who's read Cellier, General Adaptation Syndrome. This is what training is. So, I don't want to skim over this. Yeah. Not quite. Not quite. There's a few other proxies. Distance is one. Fibre type adaptation's one. So we obviously, if you could, if it wasn't so invasive, you could do a biopsy. But we use optimal cadence. Does anyone else use optimal cadence as a fibre type proxy? So optimal cadence. Okay. Optimal cadence is a sprint cycling tool. It's a bike that has an ergometer attached to it that measures peak power and it was basically designed for sprint cyclists to tell the mechanics how to gear the bike based on your fibre type, right? So if you had more high percentage of slow twitch fibres, you would push a bigger gear on a track bike, right? High fast twitch, you want to push higher cadence. Following so far? So if you then use that in reverse for an N of 1 athlete, you can get a loose proxy of what their fibre type is at any given time. So we have optimal cadence measures and we test that fairly regularly. It's probably replaced many of our former metrics. So you end up with this kind of bell curve for each athlete. So one might be here, and this is cadence, and this is watts. So this might be Tom in heavy training, and this is Tom. That's a gross exaggeration of what it is. The difference is much smaller than that, but that's how we get our data around overshoot. Again, I can come back to this, but the specifics of it are not as important as the general concept of overshoot. Yep.
Just last question. How often do you do these tests?
We do overshoot monthly. Optimal cadence monthly, and then we measure throwing every day. I've got a fairly. We're quite fortunate. We have a team of people who help me with this, but it's probably sensitive given that FlightScope's here, but we use TrackMan, which is the other version of FlightScope, which collects a lot of our data for us. And then we've got a whole lot of like RPE and subjective measures that go into it as well on a daily basis, and that goes into a big spreadsheet that gets pumped onto my phone and it's colour coded and it looks nice. It's good to have IT people to help you with this stuff. Yeah, we measure a lot, and I'll show you some of that. I had a good conversation with Gert over lunch, and younger Tom was like numbers obsessed. Literally would measure every rep, record the weight. If I've got 3 bounds today, just my program, measure every rep, compare it, write it down, see if I can beat. Good characteristic to have. Let a lot of that go now. What we know now is in order to get in peak shape, Tom needs competition. Needs to compete. Competing is probably the most important part of our peaking process now. And part of that's just a familiarity thing with moving at those kind of velocities and in that situation. But there's also a calibration effect that we call it. So you have an increase, a loose way of explaining it, but you have an increase in horsepower, you have high variability. So new capability, new capacity to put force into a throw, but you get big scattering of results because you're not quite figured out how to refine the fine motor skills. So gross motor skills goes up, fine motor skills take some time to calibrate. So we need a couple of weeks for us now, and preferably 2 to 3 competitions in order for that calibration to be really tight. When it's really tight, it's like bang on and you can't miss. That was probably, best example of that might have been Portland World Indoors 2016. It's like I don't think Tom had a throw. His PB at the time was like 22 low, and for 3 training sessions before, I don't think he had a single throw under 22. None of them went really far, but it was like, okay, we can only really screw this up from now, something major, just because of the timing of that. And then you've obviously got sociological effects if you get sick and all that kind of stuff. But at a physical level, that's kind of what's happening for us. We get increase in horsepower, calibration. Phases were 25 to 50 days of each phase, with very little modulation, so it'll be pretty similar all the way through each phase, and I'll go through the phases later. It's now a lot less than that. Most of our phases are a week. Like most of us, when you're younger, anabolic stress window is much longer. It takes a longer time. The stimulus takes a much bigger toll, and therefore the adaptation cycle is working constantly 24 hours a day. That's why babies sleep so well, right? Because it's high stress for them, and then they get massive adaptation, so they crash. Now those windows are shorter, so we have to do more frequent punctuated inputs of stress. So we'll do, for that anabolic window to stay open, we'll do shorter programs like in the evening during certain times of the day. We train in the mornings, 12 hours later, something that's non-invasive, something Tom could do at home, like nice heavy isometrics. It's a 30-minute program, 20-minute program even, high intensity, just designed to help keep that stress window going so we can drive adaptation. And then what are the values that we're driving our athletes? Who is it? Who is the person that we're bringing to this? And I like that Jean-Pierre mentioned it yesterday because it's something he's really impressed on me as a developing coach, is to understand what's the fire that's burning for this athlete. Young Tom was driven by improving spite and comparison. A lot of that was around Jacko. Jacko being such a phenomenal junior and still a fairly phenomenal athlete. There was an insecurity there for Tom. There was a, hang on, what about me? And a real drive to try and prove himself against this guy who was in his own backyard. Jacko's younger than Tom, was beating Tom beating everyone for their whole junior career for a long period of time. And that drove Tom, that was his source of fuel. And then it runs out, right? Like all sources of fuel, you need to find another one. And now it's a slightly different game that we're playing. Tom is a shot putter, that's how he sees himself. He can't pull the two apart. You can say that's healthy or unhealthy, but that's the way it is. That's a decision that he's made, and that's part of his identity. In the same way that Gerd gets introduced as an Olympic champion, it's part of the deal. You sign up for this challenge, then you're all in. At least we are. Tom genuinely likes the challenge. He likes the gritty places, the kind of hard figuring it out, the tension, the impatience, all of these kind of things is appealing to him. Doesn't want it to be easy. And there's a business component to it now too. Tom is well remunerated and he has a brand and a team around him, a commercial team around him, who I butt heads with repeatedly. But it's remiss. We can no longer just dismiss that. There is things that have to be taken into account. Any teachers in the room? Anyone recognise this model or the name for it? It's like Education 101 when you go to Teachers College, at least in Australia. This is called the Dreyfus model, and it applies to everything from learning algebra to throwing shot put to driving a car. And in any given task for any given person, you can locate yourself somewhere on this continuum. You might be a novice at playing golf, but you're probably an expert at driving a car or making a lasagna. So to use the same analogy we used yesterday with orchestra, when we learn something for the first time, you learn the notes. You need script, so it's process driven. You need rules to determine actions, right? So you need to put the music up on the stand, and you need someone to tell you do X, Y, Z, right? This is useful to start with. We need this. There's no point speaking in concepts to someone who's just picked up a hammer for the first time. They need to know which hand goes on the handle first. Right? And then you can get to orbit, and then you can get to rhythm, and then you can get to higher concepts, but you need to start here. Now, this is why do I put this up there? Partly because of my teaching bias, but also when I started working with Tom, he was somewhere in the middle around here. Thought he knew a lot more than he did, as we all do. But now he's moving up in towards these spaces. I mentioned on day one that Tom probably teaches me more about shot than I teach him now. And a lot of it is based on intuition and feel. A lot of our discussion and dialogue is conceptual. It's fuzzy. It's fuzzy. Not as rule governed as it used to be. Questions on that one? Yep, Stuart.
Yeah. When did Tom get to the point where he realised there was a lot of stuff he didn't know that he didn't know? And I think it triggered that change in relationship.
We're lucky to work with a really good, we call them mental skills coach, sports psychologist, is the same terminology. And one of the big mantras has been around growth mindset. Carol Dweck, if anyone knows his name, wrote a great book on growth mindset. And it's basically how we view the world, fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And so I'd say around 2014, we did a big amount of work on that. Actually, I'll go even earlier than that. This was before I was working with Tom. He went to the World Junior Championships in 2010, was in shape to be in the mix, wouldn't have won it, but he was throwing 20 plus, with a 6K at the time, and went out in the qualifying round and, in his words, shat the bed. 17 low and missed the final, and tears and anger and punches hole in the wall and all that kind of stuff. Once that wave of emotion for 19-year-old Tom passed, he went straight home, connected, this is credit to Tom, probably ahead of his years, connected with John Quinn, this mental skills coach, and said, I'm going to own this, I screwed this up, it's no one else's fault, how do I change it because I don't want it to happen again? And that was really the catalyst for owning his behaviour and shifting towards that growth mindset. It's one of Tom's real strengths. He doesn't blame anyone or anything other than himself. He's his own harshest critic. So there's no point. I don't drive the point home around missing out by 2 millimetres in Doha and all that kind of shit, right? No one feels that more than Tom. It's a good attribute to cultivate in any athlete. Excuse me. Again, Jean-Pierre showed this one yesterday, and you can never have too many fundamentals. Force velocity curves are the foundation of what we're trying to do in every event, from long jump to kicking a soccer ball to hitting a golf ball to throwing a shot. And it forms the foundation of our training phases. So if we start at the top, slow, eccentric and isometric, we're on the left-hand side of that contractile velocity axis. And we're going to move across from left to right as we go through, but slow, eccentric, iso is our starting phase. And here's some examples of what might fall in that training phase. So the one in the middle is the one similar one we did yesterday with the rope, but it's kind of the way I was trying to set it up. So we're looking at 3 to 5 seconds of time under tension for each rep. Some of these are a little faster, but there's a 3 count. So if we watch the squat on the right, for example, I'll be counting to Tom here, sets up strong. 3, 2, 1, so he's a little ahead of the time there. We probably should have slowed that down. But that's the...
You're pushing him down on that squat?
Pushing him down on that squat. Hard. And this is, so Tom's not the strongest, not as strong as Joe, but I don't know if Joe could do that. Eccentrically, Tom's exceptional. Joe could push out of it all day, I'm sure. But they're not the cards we're playing. Right? We move slightly along. Some of these we saw yesterday. It gets a bit more rapid, so we start to move towards more time components and time constraints to what we're doing. Rapid isometrics. Why is that bottom one not playing? Let's give that a click. Fair bit of force. Tom's 133 kilograms. This is the video on the bottom right. 3 weeks before World Champs. It's from training in Cyprus. So you can see that kind of following along, we're going from left to right on this right-hand force force. We keep going. A bit more of a speed component. So these are cleans. We use gym aware, but there's push bands and a million other ways that you can do velocity-based training. A good way to incentivize athletes, because we found when we started going to velocity-based stuff, we just drop the load and have the intention of trying to move it fast, but it was never going to be as fast as if we could actually say, here's your actual output. So we just like having that there with the iPad or phone, whatever it is, to give you some kind of reading. Taps into the competitive side of Tom, which is why I still get out and race him at times as well. From speed strength, so we're starting to move towards, we're moving through here now. More degrees per second. Another variation of the banded jumps we do. We saw David doing those yesterday, but here's a little one we came up with as well, with a throwdown. Just pulling Tom down, overload the sharp eccentric phase. And then on the right's the what I alluded to yesterday, standing triple jump test. So we measure this across phases. Tom's not a triple jumper, so it's not a bad test. I like putting in things that he's crap at. It's kind of majestic in slow motion. Like a marble.
That's lovely.
It's Free Willy. Free Willy. Yeah. And then, so that's the kind of progression of our contractile velocity training as we go through phases, and then finally comes the best one, which is rest. And I like rest cycles because I guess they go on. This is just purely self-outrageous. This is a course we played in Cyprus before we went to World Champs. It's lovely. So I'm always pushing for more rest cycles. The cycles itself has stayed the same for closing in on 10 years. So I inherited this from Tom's previous coach. I'm going to say it was very different, but similar methodology. Phases were slightly different. It was more similar to what Milko presented before, kind of like general preparation, then across. So there weren't the eccentric phases. It was more, I guess, classical periodization, block periodization. So that was what Tom's previous coach did from 2009 to 2011. And then we kind of started this, 2012, and then we started this in 2013. The progression has stayed the same, but the duration of the cycle has changed fairly drastically. Here on the screen we see two annual plans, and in 2016, one whole cycle, I remember I said it ran for like 35 to 50 days before. I don't know how exactly, this is probably even longer. This is, you can see on the right hand side of that graphic, Rio Olympics. So this is the lead in between World Indoors and Rio Olympics. We've got each of those rows is a week. So there's a couple of months worth there of one cycle. One cycle. As soon as we finish World Indoors, it'll be one cycle through until Rio. And then all of the meets on the right hand side of that just get disregard it, we'll just train through them. Each cycle now is a week, so a whole cycle goes 4 weeks, give or take. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 3, depending on how we modulate it for competitions and external demands. But there's a couple of rationales behind that. I mentioned that calibration. One of the challenges of being under heavy duress, similar to what Vilko was saying, we couldn't get high quality training in, we couldn't get high quality throwing in, I should say, because just didn't have the physical capability. We were on a constant state of fatigue for large periods of time, months on end. And so the windows of time to do quality throwing were really short, and we'd only see them a couple of times a year. So we'd maybe get 2 weeks where we had all of the horsepower. We call it beans. It's like just how fresh are you, right? We had all of the beans, and we had maybe 2 weeks to get it right. It caused a lot of tension, and it wasn't enough time. So to get that maybe twice a year was suboptimal. So we made the adjustment to change the amplitude of our training cycle so that we get those windows more frequently and we could have more meaningful throwing more year round. Now, it's not just purely because of that. As Tom's strength reserves have gone up, the necessity to have extended durations of long, heavy training is not there anymore, because we only need to touch it shortly to keep the characteristics that we want. Questions around that? Yep.
A lot of this training is very stressful. Do you have any extra check-in to keep them injury-free or some phases? Or?
We do. We've got good access to therapy, but it does take a big toll on the body. And we're fortunate. Tom's a really robust athlete. He can handle high load very well for training. That's not to say it doesn't knock him about. He gets pretty sore and grumpy and tired, and the neural fatigue of training like this is really high. I've tried it with other athletes. I mentioned that we collect a lot of data, and we do. And this is from 2018. This is a whole year's worth of data. The blue line is every training session. So every training session plotted. We throw different weighted shots in training. So how do you compare, make apples to oranges? We have a formula that we use. This formula is based off a large amount of data that we can then normalise distances, so we can compare a distance with a 6K shot to an 8K shot and know what it would equal head to head. And for anyone who's interested, statistically this has an R-squared value of 0.998, so it's pretty close to bang on. And the more data we collect, the more that we refine this normalisation metric. Questions on that? I realise not everyone's a statistician, so I'm happy to explain it a bit differently if needed. But, yep. Yeah. Yes, so it's constantly updating based on the data that we collect. Yep. So we know that X distance, with a 7.0 would equal this distance with a 6.5. They're the same.
Can you say something about each group, like younger ages, you can see more differences on the line side or the heavy side?
I can't really. Again, just on the caveat that this is Tom. This isn't. You could even apply the exact same metric to another athlete, and it wouldn't stack up. This is based on his numbers. And then the sort of orangey pink line there that you can see is the 4-day rolling average. So that's what we're looking at is to see that we want to keep that baseline as the highest standard we can. It's a 4-day average. 2018 we had the Commonwealth Games at the start of the year. Tom threw a PB in 22.67 in the leader, and then this 22.45 was the qualifying round. Each of the numbers that you can see, 22.31, boom, 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 the numbers of the meets competitions. So that kind of explains that one. And so we had a block at the start of the year. I mentioned last night Tom was in the best shape of his life coming into Commonwealth Games. He was obviously in pretty good shape in Doha as well. But we had this period where the normalised distance, so the four session moving average was pretty much above 21 metres, and it almost touched on 22 at certain periods of time. So that was for over 4 training sessions, you would get his baseline average throw was over 22 metres. So we kept that going, still subscribe to this theory that essentially the higher the baseline, the higher the peak will be on top of that. And you'll see then in 2019 when I show you that plan, how that came to fruition. This is relevant for decision making and how we, this is off the back of what I said before about shortening the amplitude of training cycles so we could have more consistent high quality throwing, and we saw that, started 2018, and it was kind of feeding results with a PB of 22.67 at the time. One of the challenges of being from New Zealand is that it's the middle of our winter when the international competitive season's on. Since we were young, Tom was young and I was, ever since I've been competing through now coaching, this basically meant being away from home for 4, 5, 6 months of the year, in the middle of the year. And given that our pinnacle event, Commonwealth Games and World Indoors, were done at the start of the year, in 2018 we thought, let's do an experiment and see what it's like to come home and train. Tom's got a girlfriend, I've got a wife and a baby. Let's see what it's like to come home and train in Christchurch in the middle of 2018. And this happened.
Holy shit.
It would be like training in Tallinn right now, similar climate, but we don't have indoor training halls. No one else was throwing, you know, Tom's just coming off a couple of 22-metre throws, diamond league meets, been away, fairly high, and then we get this. Right? So that made our decision pretty straightforward. We needed to plan for the duration of Tom's career to be away, or have an alternative and have an indoor option, which we've managed to leverage now. So it's not there yet, but we're going to have an indoor throwing option so that this can be sustainable going forward. This is 2018, this is 2019. Different shape, more consistency, and a general trend of improvement across the season. Pretty nice, pretty nice. Exactly the same yellows daily session, blue line 4-session rolling average, and the red numbers are meets with a nice one up there on the right at the end. Tom won the World Championships in 2017, won World Indoors again, won Commonwealth Games. He's well known. We started to get pulled in different directions with things like sponsors and commercial obligations. And to be perfectly fair, for between about this time last year and March, our training, the quality of training was not there. We didn't make the improvements that we wanted to make. Now, nothing really slipped to the external eye. This is where the importance of being in the daily training environment and seeing athletes every day. Little things that hadn't happened in the past. Tom would turn up to training, he'd get out of his car, he'd be on his phone to his manager or girlfriend or whatever, walk in, put it down, get through his reps and sets of training. No worries, thanks Dale, see you later. Pick up the phone, juggling things. He bought a house, actually bought a couple of houses, got a house in the US and a house in New Zealand now. A lot of residual life stress, and some of these things, he was late for a couple of appointments. Tom's never late. If he's 15 minutes early, he's late. And we basically had an intervention because what happened was the baseline of training here was not up to scratch. And it meant a domestic season here. We pride ourselves on competing well in our domestic season in February, March, and nothing over 22 metres. Yeah, these are mid-year meets. This was the start of the year. And our worst result in a long time of 2080 in Auckland. That hurt. Basically, if we've been pretty open about being a 24-metre thrower, 24-metre throwers don't throw 2080 in any circumstance. And we had to own that and make amends. So we had a pretty tough conversation, got the whole team together, maybe half a dozen of us, and decided to remedy that and make sure we don't take shortcuts to provide space for the training and recovery that needed to be there. Middle of the year, before this green box is international season, diamond leagues, yada yada yada. We sort of chunk them together so it's not too cumbersome. We can fit in training cycles for the ultimate goal of Doha on the far right hand side of that screen. Then we shut it down. I mentioned we had a month off competing in between July and August this year, and you can see there's no red numbers basically within the side of this green box, and we put in another heavy training, couple of heavy training blocks, and we saw a nice progression through these. So we set up our base in the US, made sure we got the best quality training we could. It's nice there, there's no distractions. You literally wake up, eat, sleep, train. I hadn't brought my wife and daughter over, and we had 6 weeks, probably the best training that we've ever had. And that formed the foundation for them to yield the rewards in Doha. So that might have come out as a surprise in Doha. We didn't really know what it was going to be, but we knew that based on the months prior, it was more likely than not that we were going to see something like that.
Do you mix the line doesn't have a shots in the same session?
No, we generally only throw one for the session. 6.5 to 7 kilo, 6 kilo actually in the later phases. Similar to what Vilko was saying, they only throw the 4 when they're in really good shape. I probably wouldn't throw a 4K personally. If it's too far away, it would throw off the rhythm for Tom anyway. So the general rule, I know that runs opposite to what I said the other day of heavy training, throw a light shot and vice versa. But for that calibration effect and timing, it's hard to throw a 6K without bullying it when you're a strong guy. So for connection and subtlety, nuance of connection to the ball, to throw it a really long way, you've got to be pretty bang on, pretty precise. So we pick and identify clear sessions. Not every session we're going out there trying to bang the 6K. This is also part of our reality. I mentioned the business side of things now, and Tom's got a profile, I suppose. Tom got this narrative of being a farm boy, a builder. Tom was a builder by trade, but hasn't actually touched his hammer for about 6 years now. The media still love that story of Tom the builder. And so he's got all these sponsors who are like safety apparel companies. And it's not a total lie, he actually did build for a long time, and he's a qualified builder. But now he just spends his time looking like a builder, to the great amusement of our squad, who give him no end of grief about it. As I said though, this stuff has to be factored in, because it's a concurrent part of the reality of training now and preparation is that. And then Tom's also got a real life too. I mentioned he's got a girlfriend and his own interests. He loves playing golf, and so we build in little blocks for him to go away and do that now. The boundary between what falls under a coach's jurisdiction and what doesn't is pretty fluid, but we try and have a couple of, in each heavy training cycle, have a couple of 2 or 3 day breaks, try and put it over a weekend so that Tom can go away with his girlfriend and keep things good on the home front, because things can pretty quickly unravel if we don't look after that. Doesn't matter what kind of overshoot profile and fibre type profile we get. If he gets in a fight with his missus 2 days before the Olympics, game over. Good.
So how you plan your training? Like who has a priority? Let's say you plan like next period, and like who says, okay, you say you want to train like, I don't know, training camp, whatever, but who's deciding? Is it like this commercial manager? Is it you? Is it Tom? Who makes the call?
Have you seen my presentation? See what's coming up? I'll run through this and then I might answer your question. It's a good question and very highly relevant, because you would understand this. Like it gets difficult. There's no right or wrong answer. This is how we. It's still 2019. This is how we did this year's season plan in its entirety. Start at the end. So we run this in Excel. I run this in Excel. Left hand is each of those rows is a week. Down to Doha is a lot of rows because Doha was in October. And we start to populate it from there. From there, the next layer of detail is the non-negotiables. You can take pictures if you want. I'll send it around. I know it's going to be a little small. And these are colour-coded accordingly. So those next level of meets are the New Zealand Championships. We do the New Zealand Championships because you're never too good to compete in your national championships. Eugene Diamond League. Tom's sponsored by Nike, so contractually we have to do Eugene Diamond League, so that goes in there. And then Brussels Diamond League was a Diamond League final. So outside of World Champs, the next best competition this year. So they're the next ones that go into plan. This is where the tug of war happens. So these are non-negotiable. These are the negotiables. So this is where the conversation happens. What is the priorities between meets? So you've got meet promoters and meet directors saying, we'll pay you X amount to come and compete in Zagreb. But I've mapped out our training cycle on the left-hand side there and phases that I want to go through where I want our training cycles. And we have the conversation, there's a conversation between Tom and I at this point about what's the priority. And he's pretty good. He knows it doesn't matter, none of this matters if you don't throw fast. So it's kind of a moot point, but yeah, like it's a business too, you know. So ultimately, I make the call, and then we tell Stubbsy, the agent, okay, these are the meets we're going to do, and then on occasion, where we want meets as well. So we need meets in this block. Go away and find us, tell us what we can do. We want some meets in Europe or in the US or whatever at this time. And then we ultimately end up with the skeleton of our training cycle there on the left-hand side. Then a bit more detail, and then the logistics. So the last layer is, okay, we know we've got to get this amount of training in, where are we going to be, where do we have to be, we need to go on training camp here. We have to bridge some gaps between meets. Doesn't necessarily make sense to go all the way from Europe back to New Zealand or back to the US, so we need to train in Europe. Who do we know in Europe? And this is our season plan. Pretty simple.
How do you feel about training? Does it work better at home or away?
Away.
Do you want time to think about that?
But you can't live with you? Same? Yeah. Same. I mean, it's a big deal. It's hard. As I said, we are away. I'm not anymore. I travel a lot more. I'm back and forth because with the young family and other athletes, I can't afford to be away for 5 months at a time.
You're talking about being selfish, and you get a reward. Do you feel that you get a reward? Not just seeing Tom getting the gold. Do you get a reward personally? Does your family get a reward?
My family gets a reward. I'm a full-time coach. I'm paid to do what I do.
Yeah.
Which is a luxury. I met many more experienced coaches, better coaches than me, people who probably deserve the opportunity. I had breakfast this morning with Terry. The opportunity to coach professionally at my age is something I'm not ungrateful for. Like so yes, I do get a reward. On the performance side of things, the reward's not seeing Tom win world champs or throw 2290 or Diamond Leagues or any of that. The reward's the little stuff between, it's an athlete saying thank you to you at the end of a training session. You've got, it's different. It used to be you get your validation from winning stuff at the start, right, and being attached to Tom, like a +1 kind of thing. But I honestly couldn't care less now, and I've had to make sure my job is not to be liked, but rather to be respected, so that, you know, in 10, 15 years down the track, when we're in this situation and Gerd reconnects with Destine, respect is more important, and I'd like to. That means right now everyone wants to be Tom's friend. He's not short on friends, so it's not my job to be his friend. It's my job to call him on his bullshit and bad decisions and bad behaviour or priorities and values, and make sure he stays true to his cause. Because no one else is going to do it. Certainly his agents aren't going to do it because they're getting paid. And that's difficult because, I mean, so am I. But I don't take a percentage of anything Tom makes, I never will. He might flick me the odd pair of Nike shoes through, but that doesn't cost him anything. So just keeping those relationships at the forefront is a high priority for us right now.
I'll do a slide. One more slide.
I do, yeah, just this, I think this is the last one. So then the question is, well then what? Right, so I said we're in the formation phase for 2020. We've had our review, Tom's back in training, and this is not so much what we're going to do in the plan, but what matters. These are the philosophical foundations that matter to me. We have to serve the craft. I mentioned that last night, that there's a really imperative that I feel to give back to the sport. So things like competing domestically for us, you're never too good to compete at your own national championships. Respect the sport, fight for the sport, and do it the right way. Do it the right way. Don't put our own ego ahead of the problem. The problem is, how do we make the shot go further? And that at times has meant for me, and will continue to mean, checking our own ego and making sure we don't put that ahead of that first question. So if there's people better placed to consult on areas, it means I have to be prepared to know the bounds, the limits of my own knowledge and understanding, and seek advice and help from others beyond that. Because me pretending to know stuff I don't know, or make decisions that I'm not placed to make, is putting my ego before the problem. Doesn't matter. It's amazing what you can do when it doesn't matter who does it. And we saw that footage last night of a pretty high pressure situation, one throw, world championship final, 2 guys have gone past you in the last round. They're the moments in life you get thrown very infrequently, but it's what you grow up wanting, right? It's whether it's a World Cup final, or you step up to the penalty spot, or you've got a free throw to make in the NBA finals. This is very rare moments, and we've got one coming up in Tokyo next year. We've got to be prepared to go towards that pressure situation. There was a great TED talk released recently about this, and people who are successful in life are the ones who walk towards the gunfire. When every fibre in your body is saying get away, retreat, pull back, go conservative. So we make our plan for 2020 and we just go, well, let's just repeat what we did in 2019 because that's safe and we know it's going to, it'll probably work. Well, no, we know next year's a different year. There's different parameters. We've got to be prepared to innovate again and change it because we're not at 24 metres yet. And as soon as and stay with that growth mindset and avoid risk aversion and conservative thinking. That is the end. We've had a few questions along the way, but maybe, I don't know how we're going for time. We've got a couple of minutes. Yep. Yeah. If you want to do more, or we can put a full stop on it there.
One question, just maybe any advice, because I think many coaches as athletes who are dealing with a problem that they need proof. They need proof every day. And as a coach, many times you know that proof is not needed because process is on the way how it should be. So how to reduce this approval factor, like how to work with athletes that they don't search so much approval every day in weight room, in throwing.
The value of positivity and storytelling, I think, as a coach. There's a strong inspiration piece to coaching, and even though internally we all have doubts about whether something's going to work or whether. I was fortunate to work with a coach who had pretty much no biomechanical understanding, would go against a lot of modern ways of coaching and coaching praxis, but he was a hell of a storyteller and a dreamer. even if I didn't believe it, he believed it for me, and basically told me it until it happened. And the power of those narratives and storytelling is still relevant for us now. Because if I kind of do this, and maybe if we get it right, like 20, well, let's just say 24, you know, why not? Well, no, we've got to say it's got to be done with conviction, and this is going to happen, and this is how we're going to do it. It's more important to be committed than correct. Maybe.
How much being a teacher has helped you being a coach, to be a coach?
I didn't really have any other option. I was a teacher. It's certainly flavoured my lens on how we view it. It's been a limiting factor in a lot of ways because I'm not a biomechanist, I'm not a physiologist. Strength and conditioning's been a big area of rapid learning curve for me because I had no formal training as this, but I think once I came to peace with this is probably a virtue of being a beginning coach, or a young coach, it was not an option to coach from a place of authority because I was a modest shot putter. Didn't have a lot of authority to stand there with a white lab coat on and a clipboard and say, here's a formula for how to throw 2290. I couldn't do this, I'd be lying pretty clearly, you just see straight through this. But what I think one of my own strengths was curiosity and honesty and openness. And so to be able to leverage this and then ask good questions of people who know more than me, be receptive, learn faster than most, that's our point of difference. So coming here and sharing with you guys pretty openly what we do, I'm happy to do this because I get more in return than I get coming here. You know, I pick up little things and little conversations that I'll take back. And, yeah, the kind of, we live in the Google generation, right? Information's readily available, and the old training secrets are debunked. You know, like we know what people are doing. So the currency of coaching now for me is not good answers, but good questions. And that probably was started with my teaching background.